first welcome our first guest from Minocqua, Joe Handrick. He served in the Assembly in the 1990s as a Republican, and he's also done more work since then in terms of data analysis, as well as helping other Republican candidates and officials. So welcome Joe Handrick to the stage. Good to see you right here. And before Mr. Handrick was in the Assembly, someone else had his Assembly seat, and that would be Jim Holperin. Jim Holperin is from Eagle River. He also served in the State Senate and as Secretary of the Department of Tourism. So everyone welcome Jim Holperin to the stage. Welcome. Welcome, Jim.
Cool.
So I'm already thrown off, you guys, because where are the fisticuffs? This guy took your seat, Jim. I mean, you're shaking hands. I thought we're supposed to be, trying to beat each other. So what are your guys', you have a good relationship?
Excellent, excellent. And interestingly enough, the very first time I appeared in public was in this room at a debate with Jim Holperin when I ran against him. And the last time I appeared with Jim Holperin in public was at a sportsman convention where I was giving him an award for being a friend of sportsmen. So I think in there is a message for modern day politicians, which is you can disagree on issues and you can battle it out during the day, but at the end of the day, you ought to treat each other decently and you can still get along and give each other awards and be nice to each other and follow each other's career and wish each other well. It doesn't have to be this nasty business that it's turned into.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on that, Jim?
Yeah, well, I agree completely, Joel, with that. And of course, that's easy for us to say now because we don't have a stake in anything anymore. But it has become nasty and vile and vicious. And that's just the accepted norm in politics today. And that's unfortunate for voters, unfortunate for the people in office. And it doesn't look good for democracy.
We're going to get into all of this. So just to kind of lay out this evening, I'm going to ask each of you about your backgrounds, how you joined your respective party. We'll look at some data through the years of how Wisconsin has changed electorally. We'll look at the 2024 election in Wisconsin as well. And then we'll talk about how politics has changed, as you guys have had a front row seat of that. So let's start with Joe. Joe, I know I can smell the Ronald Reagan on you right now. I'm sure he was a big inspiration for you. Tell me about your upbringing and why you decided to join the Republican Party.
Ronald Reagan was, and to this day is one of my heroes and the kind of person that I think exemplifies standing up for what you believe in, but being a decent human being. And my entry into politics was largely driven by my family. My parents were the kind of people that were always involved with something in Minocqua. Either town government, volunteer work, the Lions Club, Winter-Rama, Beefarama, Aquarama, all the Ramas we have in Minocqua. They were always involved, and we all learned as kids that when you're a part of community, you get involved. And when I was a young person during the Carter administration, Jimmy Carter put energy prices, if you remember, well, you wouldn't remember, but energy prices were skyrocketing, so Jimmy Carter put price controls on propane. My father owned a small propane company. So he was not allowed to raise the price of propane over a couple-year period. Meanwhile, his costs kept going up. So the big boys, they handled it just fine. But little propane companies like my father, he had to sell it. He went out of business. Ronald Reagan got elected, took those price controls off of the energy sector, and my father then actually started his business again and got all his customers back. That was really pretty much that baked it for me, that this was the philosophy of government that I was going to follow.
Yeah, it's interesting to note that I think it kind of depends on when you're born and who the leaders are of the country and of the state when you're kind of in those formative years. I'm curious, Jim, did you have a similar experience when you joined the Democratic Party?
Well, I dropped out of law school in 1974 and was in Madison and worked part-time at the Department of Revenue as an errand boy. And in the evening, I would go up to the state senate and I would sit in the gallery and watch the proceedings. Had no previous interest in politics, really. My family wasn't political. And watch kind of some of the titans of that time, Bob Caston and Fred Risser and Doug LaFollette and all the names that were, Tom Petri at that time. And that fascinated me. These people were making important decisions that affected the lives of everyday Wisconsinites all over the state. And I thought, this is a really fascinating occupation, profession, if you will. And so shortly after that, I applied for a position in the Assembly Democratic Caucus. It could have been the Assembly Republican Caucus, I guess. But I got it because of my work in radio previously. I got accepted and worked there for a few years. And it was fascinating work. And I wrote letters for legislators and helped them with constituent relations. A couple of years later, I went to the Senate and was hired as assistant chief clerk in the Senate, did that for a couple of years, and then moved back up to northern Wisconsin, always keeping my interest in politics alive, and just decided to run for the state assembly. I think people thought it might have been a lost cause then because the seat had been held by Republicans, but I worked fairly hard at it, got elected, and served for 12 years there, and then in the Senate later.
And I have to point out, this is actually a fact that Joe told me. Jim Holpern is the only person in the United States, I think, to survive 2 recall attempts. Is that right, Jim?
As far as I know, it's going to be on my headstone, Dan, so let's...
2 recalls failed, right.
He can't recall, but yes.
Well, I think we're going to get into the meat of this and how politics has changed. And, you don't really see rural Democratic representatives in the state of Wisconsin and kind of across the country as well. So let's turn it over to you, Joe. You've been following kind of the data of the state. You do data analysis for many Republicans still, so we have some slides prepared for you. So tell us about this shift in politics in Wisconsin. I think a lot of it comes down to Donald Trump's presence.
Sure, and a lot of the data analysis I do is actually for the non-elected people, for nonpartisans, the people in the lobbying world and that need to follow the elections and know which side is going to come out on top. So the data I try to put forward, I try to be objective.
Sure.
And not put a partisan twist on it. But if you want to go to that first slide, there's really been 2 big changes in the last 40 years. The first is that Wisconsin has long been a state that either party can carry statewide, but yet the way Republicans or Democrats get to 50% today looks radically different than it did 40 years ago. And I'll show a couple maps that shows that. The other change is, and this involves Jim Holpern, and I'll show how that is later, there's a lot fewer ticket-splitting voters. You used to have a lot more people that were willing to go in and vote for a Democrat and a Republican and a Democrat and a Republican. That universe of people is much smaller nowadays, and that's part of what has led to some of the polarization. So if we want to go to the next slide, this is show that first picture. This shows what it looked like in 1980 when Bob Caston won Wisconsin for the U.S. Senate very narrowly. You can see that Madison and Milwaukee, blue, they've always been blue, they still are, but a large swath of northern and western Wisconsin was also blue. Now let's fast forward to Ron Johnson's victory just 2 years ago. He also won Wisconsin very narrowly as a Republican, but the map looks very different. Madison and Milwaukee are now much more blue than they ever were. And a lot of that blue in northern Wisconsin, including our neighbor Forest County and western Wisconsin, is now red. So what's happened is the state's still 50-50, but now a lot of that Democratic vote is concentrated in Milwaukee and Madison, and the Republican vote is sort of spread out and taken over much of the rest of the state. The next map, I think, will show that. Well, this is just the 2 maps side by side, so you can see the change. And then this next map will show what these dots are Biden and Trump margins by county. So the larger the red dot, the more votes Donald Trump won by. Same with Biden with the blue dots. And you can see that northern and western Wisconsin, which used to be a lot of blue, is now red. But look at Dane County and Milwaukee County, that intense level of blue that comes out of those 2 counties. That's really how the state shifted. And then the other shift that's come along since Trump has been on the scene is that Republicans no longer do nearly as well in the suburbs, but they do better in rural areas. And I got a slide to illustrate that for you. Elm Grove is a Milwaukee suburb. Now remember, Mitt Romney in 2012 lost Wisconsin, but he got 69% in Elm Grove. Donald Trump, who barely lost Wisconsin, in 2020 only got 51% in that same suburb. That's a visualization of just how much damage has happened to Republicans in suburbs in the Donald Trump era. Particularly suburban women don't like President Trump. But the flip of that is up in northern Wisconsin in White River, it's a town in Ashland County, you can see Trump did significantly better than Mitt Romney. So that's what I call the Trump effect. That's a lot of how the state has changed. We can go to the next one. Now, so that's that polarization I was talking about, that we're not even though we're a purple state, there's very few purple areas. There's either blue areas or there's red areas. Then remember the second factor I talked about was there's fewer ticket splitters. This is, to me, an amazing slide. In 1990 and 84, there's a picture of the old 34th Assembly District. Ronald Reagan got 62% of the vote. And on the same day, on the same ballot, with the same voters, Jim Halpern, Democrat, also got 62%.
This guy, 62%.
20,
Thank you.
Yeah.
that's a 24% swing. That won't happen today. It just won't happen. The next slide, this continued into the 90s, same district. Bill Clinton, Democrats could actually win the 34th district at the top of the ticket into the 90s. Bill Clinton beat Bob Dole in the 34th. But some guy named Joe Hendrick on the same day as a Republican got 66% in the state assembly, again, an 18-point swing. Now let's fast forward to the last election. And this is not in any way a commentary on Rob Swearingen. It's a commentary on what's happened to the elasticity of the electorate. Notice Michaels won the 34th district. Even though he lost statewide by a fairly good amount, he still won the 34th district overwhelmingly with 58%. Rob Swearingen was a few points ahead of him, but you see now it's only a 4-point swing. That's that lack of elasticity, that people are voting much more straight party. They're either going to vote blue or they're going to vote red. And that's actually rather typical. Rob Swearingen performed 4% better than Michaels. Incumbents around the state usually will perform 3 to 5% better than the top of the ticket because they are the incumbent. They've been, and Jim knows this, every day you're hopefully helping somebody with a problem with the DNR or helping get their unemployment benefits. And so incumbents do tend to do better, which is why I think in the U.S. Senate race, Tammy Baldwin's going to benefit from being an incumbent too. And I think for Eric Hovde to beat Tammy Baldwin, I think it takes Donald Trump winning Wisconsin by more than just a little. I think he has to win it by a number of points in order to bring Eric Hovde with him, and I don't see that happening. I believe that's the last of the slides, but hopefully that gives a picture of just how things have changed over this time. And you can see from that as the state loses that elasticity and has fewer ticket splitters and now has red areas and blue areas, those areas are more likely or less likely to elect candidates who perhaps are moderate. Madison used to have a Republican congressman in the 1990s, but he was a pro-choice Republican congressman. But Republicans can't win in Madison now. And so the districts are either blue or they're red. And so then in the primaries, you tend to get candidates more like AOC on the left or Marjorie Taylor Greene on the right.